On October 7, 2001, the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom. 17 years later, we're still at war in Afghanistan and still spending money.
People came in there for 6 months or a year, spent money like drunken sailors, and nobody was ever held accountable.
And now a new obstacle. The U.S. military classified much of the information.
The only people who don't know what's going on in Afghanistan are the people who are paying for it.
On a hill overlooking the Palestinian village of Bet Jala, south of Jerusalem, we look down upon the West Bank separation barrier.
In 1 month, we lost 128 people that were murdered by terror attacks. And people said to the government, enough is enough. Do something, build something.
When the largest section of the barrier was completed in 2006, the suicide bombing stopped.
Without the wall, we cannot have border security. And all you have to do is ask Israel. Look what happened with them.
The idea of bringing corporate investment home has been something of a holy grail for several administrations.
That's why we're closing one of our biggest tax loopholes.
What it took.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is passed.
Was a complete overhaul of the tax system and an end to the exotic offshore tax shelters.
Will that change as a result of this tax cut for corporations?
We need money coming back to this country. The average American is going to benefit from this with the tax cuts.
Hello, I'm Sharyl Attkisson. Welcome to Full Measure. We begin with an important progress report on Afghanistan, where we're fighting the longest war in American history. Today's 16-year-olds weren't even born when we invaded the country for shielding 9/11 mastermind Osama bin Laden. Our longest war has also gobbled up record U.S. tax dollars, which is why we were so surprised to learn how bad things still are today in Afghanistan and what we've gotten for our money. On October 7, 2001, the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom to disrupt the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, which was operating freely under Afghanistan's Islamic fundamentalist leadership.
Right there.
Enduring Freedom toppled the Taliban government.
We've been there for 16 years. And our mission is to, originally it was to kick the terrorists out who attacked the United States, and then to help create a government that would be supported by their people that could keep the terrorists away from attacking us.
How much money have we spent doing that so far?
For reconstruction alone, it's about $120 billion.
Inspector General John Sopko, an Obama appointee, watches over the spending of all that money. What would you say is our biggest accomplishment there?
We have created a working government, working military. Healthcare has improved for the average Afghan. Education has improved for the average Afghan, but at great cost.
Is it oversimplification to say that we have helped develop a government that is friendly with us, but they are still fighting the people we consider terrorists, the Taliban, and those clashes are going on daily?
Absolutely.
More than 16 years after they were ousted from power, Taliban fighters still wage a stubborn insurgency marked by daily assaults, suicide attacks, and ambushes against U.S. forces. Sopko says Afghanistan remains so unstable today that he and other watchdogs can't even get around the country to oversee spending on projects.
So every day there's another attack. So security situation is very bad.
Recent annual figures shatter known records. In 1 year alone, more than 11,000 Afghan citizens killed in clashes with the Taliban. The number of security incidents, its highest since tracking began. More than 660,000 people fled their homes, up 40% over the year before. Is there a way to explain why the security situation could be so bad after we've tried so hard to help?
Well, part of it is that we spent too much money too fast, and we didn't hold the Afghans accountable either. So they had officials in their government, particularly in their military, who were stealing the U.S. funds. I mean, there are cases of where they were actually stealing the fuel that we were buying for them, stealing the weapons, selling it to the Taliban.
SOPCO has documented billions of dollars in boondoggles in a country that's legendary for its corruption. Salaries paid to so-called ghost soldiers who don't exist. Loans provided to hotel projects and apartments that were never built. A fleet of planes bought, never used, and quickly scrapped after SOPCO began an inquiry. Where are the failures that lead to so much waste and fraud?
People came in there for 6 months or a year, spent money like drunken sailors, and nobody was ever held accountable. And we spent too much money, too fast, in too small a country with too little oversight. And that's one reason why we lost all the money.
What types of players have benefited, if not the U.S. taxpayers?
Corrupt Afghan contractors, officials, corrupt U.S. officials and contractors, foreigners from other countries who have gotten on the gravy train and have not been held accountable.
And now SOPCO faces a new obstacle. The U.S. military recently classified much of the information he says he needs to do his job and evaluate how our tax money is spent.
Basically, everything that the U.S. taxpayer would need to know to make a determination of how well his money's being spent. And that's very upsetting.
We asked him to show us some examples.
So some of the information they're classifying, like I said, the Afghan National Security Forces casualties. We've been reporting that since 2009, but now it's classified. The proportion of actual troops in Afghanistan, Afghan troops, in relationship to their stated goals of how many troops they're going to have. That's now classified. The proportion of their assigned strength, authorized strength for the police, that's now classified. And you just go down the list. Remember, we're paying for the Afghan police their salaries. We're paying for the Afghan military salaries. We can't report on how many soldiers actually show up.
What could they be trying to keep from the American public?
Well, look, Sharyl, you and I have been in Washington long enough. We know the government never classifies good news. The bottom line is the Taliban and the insurgents know what's going on. The American military knows what's going on. The Afghan government knows what's going on. The only people who don't know what's going on in Afghanistan are the people who are paying for it.
Who's decided to classify this?
So we're going to find out about that. But we still don't have the actual classifier named. That's interesting because the official policy is that if something's classified, you got to have a name or initial of who classified it.
Knowing what you know now, if you could go back at the very beginning, 2002, what would you recommend we had done differently on the front end?
Have a more complete strategy that identifies who are the corrupt elements in the government, which tribe, which group you have to avoid. We got into bed with a lot of bad people, and now we can't get out. And this is the biggest point. You have to have people accountable. I have spoken to so many contracting officers, U.S. contracting officers, who have told me they get an annual performance ratings, not based on whether any of the contracts are good or not, just on how much taxpayer dollar they put on contract. If that's the way you reward our contracting officers, are we surprised that money's being wasted? We did a very poor job of spending the money and protecting the taxpayer dollars. We have wasted billions of dollars in Afghanistan.
The Defense Department didn't respond to our questions about why so much information about the situation in Afghanistan was recently classified or who was responsible for the decision to classify it. Ahead on Full Measure, while we've been talking about building a border wall in the last decade or two, Israel did it. We'll go to Israel and see what we can learn from them. It was one of then-candidate Trump's first promises, build the wall on the Mexican border. Over a decade ago, Israel built a wall of its own to stop terrorist attacks. We wanted to see the so-called separation barrier for ourselves and find out what America can learn from a wall that works. Full Measure contributing correspondent John Huddy reports from the Israeli West Bank border.
On a hill overlooking the Palestinian village of Bet Jala, south of Jerusalem, we look down upon the West Bank separation barrier, snaking its way through the valley and wrapping around the rocky hillsides. It's an impressive view, one that Dr. Danny Terza knows well. The retired Israeli Army colonel was the architect of the separation barrier, or as critics call it, the Apartheid Wall. 360 miles of fence and concrete barrier that surrounds the West Bank and its nearly 3 million residents.
In March 2002, in 1 month, we lost 128 people that were murdered by terror attacks. And people said to the government, enough is enough. We cannot live with such level of terror. Do something, build something.
Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon approved construction of the separation barrier in 2002. It took 5 years to build. The Israeli military, or IDF, says during the peak terror years in Israel, 1,300 people were killed by suicide bombings. When the largest section of the barrier was completed in 2006, the suicide bombing stopped. Israeli leaders credit a combination of the barrier and Israeli security forces for stopping the spread of terrorist attacks. President Trump noted the Israeli wall just this week.
They say without the wall, we cannot have border security. And all you have to do is ask Israel. Look what happened with them.
We are on the green line. It's a border between the Israeli and the West Bank. That is a Palestinian area.
Lieutenant Colonel Ivry Elbaz is commander of the IDF's Givati Brigade that patrols the northern West Bank border.
They can go, and it's not a jail. It says because it's a security fence, we are allowing them to pass when it's needs.
On the day we visited, 21 people were caught trying to illegally cross into Israel. Terrorism was not a factor this particular day, but infiltration attempts are constant.
It's a combination of a sensor that gave us time of the touching or pressure.
So you could distinguish if it's a bird or a human being.
Or a human being or animal.
The Trump administration is considering 8 prototypes for the Mexico border. And like Israel, there will be a combination of wall and fencing, and in some parts of the border, natural terrain to serve as a barrier. In Israel, 30-foot high, nearly 2-foot thick concrete barriers total less than 10% of the West Bank border. On one side of the wall here in Bethlehem, it's blackened and scorched from the years of fighting, of riots. There's even empty tear gas canisters. And then just on the other side here, it becomes a colorful display of protest that's become even a tourist destination. Anton is the mayor of Bethlehem, the Palestinian-controlled city in the West Bank and the biblical birthplace of Jesus. He says there will always be anger if the wall remains standing, anger that often erupts into violence.
You use the word violence several times, and I don't like the word. I don't like it at all.
You wouldn't call what we're seeing violence?
When the people went out in protesting, they went out protesting. It's a civil protestation. They have nothing in their hands, and the clashes became as a result of the treatment that the Israeli soldiers are treated the people in Palestine.
Many Palestinians have compared the concrete sections of barrier to that of prison walls. Others who are allowed to cross complain of long waits and days when the Israeli government shuts down the border crossings without notice. Dr. Terza says America faces similar challenges like that of Israel, including balancing the rights of people on the ground and protecting the security of a nation. But he says, while Israel's separation barrier has been a success, it was never meant to be permanent. You walked every kilometer, every mile of the wall. Would you like to see the wall removed one day?
I really hope that I will be the one, I will be alive, I will be the one that will take off the first stone of Jerusalem. I really hope that there will come a day and we can have peace agreement between the sides and there will be no frightened of terror and we can remove these walls and live here normally and quietly with our neighbors, the Palestinians.
For now, Israel's hulking border wall and long winding fence will remain standing. For Full Measure, I'm John Huddy in Jerusalem.
Coming up on Full Measure, part of President Trump's tax overhaul that some in both parties have wanted for years. Goodbye to those offshore tax havens and why that's good for business. America's tax brackets changed this year following the tax overhaul President Trump signed just before Christmas. One part of that plan has had support within both parties for years. The effort to bring trillions of dollars back to the U.S. from companies using offshore tax shelters. Josie Sturman takes a look at the havens, how they worked, and why they're now coming to an end.
We're going to bring back probably $4 trillion from overseas. Nobody knows the exact number, but it's massive. It'll be over $3 trillion. It could be $5 trillion.
The idea of bringing all that corporate investment home has been something of a holy grail for several White House administrations.
That's why we're closing one of our biggest tax loopholes.
It was one of the first initiatives of the Obama administration and one of the last.
A lot of this stuff is legal, not illegal.
What it took.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is passed.
Was a complete overhaul of the tax system and a cut in the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%.
This country has done nothing with its corporate tax rate for years. Every other country has recognized the economic benefit of lowering taxes.
David Williams is president of the Taxpayers Protection Alliance.
Does this eliminate the need to go offshore with your money?
Lowering the corporate tax rate absolutely eliminates the need to leave. Whether it's an inversion or just moving your company elsewhere, this eliminates that need and really that financial need.
That financial drive and how companies gamed the system was most recently exposed this fall by the so-called Paradise Papers. Named after the idyllic tropical islands where many companies hid billions of dollars in complicated shell schemes.
It's legal, but it allows them to pay less taxes and to face less accountability than everyone else in America.
Sasha Shevkin is with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. His team poured over 13.4 million documents, most of them coming from an elite offshore law firm called Appleby, headquartered in Hamilton, Bermuda.
What Appleby does is creates and manages offshore companies to help them manage their financial affairs. So they set up paper companies in the Cayman Islands and Bermuda and the Isle of Man and other tax havens around the world to help their clients avoid taxes.
Tax havens aren't limited to paradise.
We don't stash money on some Caribbean island.
In the case of Apple, for example, the Paradise Papers exposed the consumer tech giant had found another treasure island.
Apple CEO Tim Cook testified before Congress about Apple's tax practices and said very indignantly,
"We pay all the taxes we owe, every single dollar. We not only comply with the laws, but we comply with the spirit of the laws. We don't depend on tax gimmicks. We don't move intellectual property offshore and use it to sell our products back to the United States to avoid taxes."
What the Paradise Papers show is that ultimately Apple didn't end up on a Caribbean offshore island. It ended up in Jersey, which is an island in the English Channel. So what's very clear is that it continued its strategies of aggressively trying to use offshore to reduce taxes.
Apple wasn't the only company outed in the Paradise Papers. Others include Nike and Allergan, the manufacturer of Botox.
They have not broken any laws. He should not be embarrassed at all about what he has done.
Williams says American companies like Apple, in the past, have had a duty to their shareholders to optimize their revenue, and that usually meant finding a lower tax rate offshore. At 35%, America's was one of the highest in the world.
And that's the biggest argument when people talk about something like the Paradise Papers and the discovery that these corporations are putting their money overseas, as they say the average American takes the hit here. Will that change as a result of this tax cut for corporations?
So the average American is going to benefit from this with the tax cuts. But on a bigger scale, people are going to benefit from companies coming back to this country. Unemployment will continue probably to go down, and we're going to see more revenue and really more economic growth. An expanding economy will help everybody, and that's why this is so important, is to entice the business to come back here, whether it's through lower regulations or lower taxes, but we need business to relocate back to the United States. We need money coming back to this country.
Walmart, the nation's largest private employer, increased the minimum wage for its employees and handed out bonuses of up to $1,000. By some counts, 125 companies are giving out those bonuses, including our parent company Sinclair Broadcasting, all citing the positive impact of the new tax structure. Next on Full Measure, after a triple punch of natural disasters last year, red flags about how FEMA is spending your tax money for emergency aid. In Follow the Money, FEMA has a problem. A report released by the Inspector General that oversees the emergency agency went so far as to say FEMA management poses a significant risk to taxpayer dollars. The triple punches of Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria created an estimated $31.5 billion in damages, according to FEMA, making it one of the most costly seasons on record. But the IG has raised a red flag about where and how billions of your tax dollars in relief money may be spent, based on the agency's past performance. Over a 9-year period, audits raised questions in surprising numbers of grant programs. In 2017, an astonishing record 92% of $2.25 billion spent came under question. In an 8-year period, the Inspector General made 1,400 recommendations for fixes. Their conclusion: the problems continue because FEMA does not manage the funds or hold recipients accountable. Next week on Full Measure.
The Trump presidency, from what we have seen, could be dire. You think stocks, for example, could crash. I mean, it's a significant thing to say.
Did you see all the corrections the media's been making? They're saying, sorry, we made a... They've been doing that all year. They never apologized.
Every tweet, every movement, every inconsistency, every outrage, whatever, is tracked in real time and in multimedia fashion. And so, unfortunately, some of these things have led to mistakes.
The media and the president. We look back at year one of journalism in the era of Trump. It's been one like no other. Until next week, we'll be looking for more stories that hold powers accountable.